The morning Lillian Sawyer arrived in Dusthaven, Texas. The sky was the color of a bruise, and every man on the main street stopped what he was doing to watch her step down from the stagecoach with nothing but a worn leather satchel and the kind of quiet dignity that made grown men feel ashamed of themselves. It was the spring of 1874, and Dusthaven was not the kind of town that inspired poetry. It sat in the middle of the Texas hill country like something the land had coughed up and forgotten about. A cluster of sun-bleached buildings pressed against a red dirt road that turned to mud whenever it rained and cracked into plates when it dried. There was a saloon, a general store, a livery stable, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a sheriff's office that smelled permanently of tobacco and old leather. The people who lived there were tough and practical, the kind who did not waste sentiment on things they could not eat or ride. Lillian was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned up beneath a simple bonnet, green eyes that had seen more sorrow than a woman her age deserved, and hands that were already calloused from years of work. She had come from a small town in Missouri where her father had died 6 months before, leaving behind nothing but debts and a reputation for drinking. She had sold what little there was to sell, paid what little she could pay, and answered an advertisement in the Missouri Courier that read, "Seeking a capable woman for honest employment as housekeeper on a cattle ranch in Dusthaven, Texas. Room and board provided. Fair wages. Inquire to Mr. Clarence Webb." She had written to Clarence Webb. Clarence Webb had written back. She had packed her satchel and climbed aboard a stagecoach, and now here she was. What the advertisement had not told her was that Clarence Webb was 71 years old, partially deaf, deeply set in his ways, and that his cattle ranch, the Double W, was managed almost entirely by his foreman, a man named August Whitaker. Lillian did not know any of this yet. She stood on the boardwalk outside the stage depot, looking up and down the street with the composed expression of someone who had long since learned that showing uncertainty was an invitation for trouble. "Miss Sawyer," she turned. A man was walking toward her from the direction of the livery stable, leading a pair of horses hitched to a buckboard wagon. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the temples beneath the brim of a worn brown hat. He wore a plain work shirt rolled to the elbows, and his jaw was set with the kind of permanent seriousness that comes from carrying too much responsibility for too many years. But his eyes, when they met hers, were a warm and unexpected shade of amber, almost golden in the morning light, and they held something she did not immediately recognize. Steadiness, perhaps, or patience. "I am," she said, "August Whitaker. I manage the Double W for Mr. Webb." He took off his hat briefly, which she noted as a courtesy, then put it back on. "Mr. Webb sends his apologies. His joints have been troubling him this week. He would have come himself otherwise." "I appreciate you coming," Lillian said, and she meant it simply and without performance. August looked at her satchel, then at her. "Is that everything?" "It is." He nodded, not with judgment, but with the brief acceptance of a man who had learned that people carried what they could. He took the satchel from her hand before she could protest and set it in the wagon bed, then offered her a hand up to the seat. She took it, and for just a moment she was aware of how solid his grip was, the rough warmth of his palm against hers, and then she was seated and looking out at the road, and he was walking around to the other side and climbing up beside her with the ease of someone who had been doing it all his life. They rode out of Dusthaven in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The land opened up around them, rolling hills covered in cedar and live oak, the early spring grass a pale and optimistic green, the sky beginning to lighten at its edges as the morning settled into itself. A red-tailed hawk circled lazily above a distant ridgeline. "Have you worked on a ranch before?" August asked, not looking at her, his eyes on the road ahead. "No," Lillian said, "but I know how to work. I kept house for my father for 11 years. Cooking, laundry, preserving, mending. I learned quickly." He nodded. "Mr. Webb's a fair man. He won't ask anything unreasonable." "What about you?" she said, and when he glanced at her she added, "You manage the place. I imagine you'll have requests as well." The corner of his mouth moved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Coffee before 6 in the morning," he said. "Everything else can wait." She almost smiled back. Almost. The double W came into view after about 40 minutes of riding. First the windmill spinning slowly against the sky, then the long white fence of the south pasture, then the main house itself. A solid 2-story structure of limestone and cedar with a wide front porch and a kitchen garden just beginning to show green along its south wall. Beyond the house, the bunkhouse sat at a respectful distance, and beyond that, a barn and several outbuildings. A handful of hands were visible in the distance, moving cattle along a far fence line. The whole thing had an air of honest, hard-won order. "It's lovely," Lillian said, before she could stop herself. August looked at it for a moment as though he was seeing it fresh. "It's good land," he said. Clarence Webb was waiting on the porch. He was a small, wiry man with a white beard and keen blue eyes that had lost none of their sharpness with age, even if his ears had. He took Lillian's hand in both of his and shook it with genuine warmth. "Miss Sawyer, welcome, welcome. Come inside, come inside. Martha," he called toward the house, and a stout woman in her 50s appeared in the doorway. "Martha, this is Miss Sawyer. She'll be taking over from you when you go to your sister's." Martha, it turned out, had been the cook and housekeeper, and was leaving at the end of the week to help her sister in San Antonio, who had just had twins. She spent 3 days showing Lillian everything: the temperament of the wood-burning stove, the location of every jar and tin in the pantry, the particular way Mr. Webb liked his biscuits, the best places to draw water from the well, the days the laundry needed to be done to account for the drying time in the shade, because full sun made the whites go yellow in this particular climate. Lillian absorbed everything with focused attention, asking questions when she needed to, writing things down in a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket. On the second day, she was in the kitchen just before dawn, getting the fire going in the stove for the first time on her own, when the back door opened and August came in without knocking, which she quickly understood was simply how it was done. He stopped when he saw her and looked briefly surprised, as though he had expected to find the kitchen empty. "Coffee's not ready yet," she said, "but it will be in 10 minutes. He stood for a moment in the doorway, hat in hand. "You're up early." "I didn't want to be late." He came inside and sat at the kitchen table without ceremony, setting his hat on the edge of it, and she turned back to the stove and focused on the task at hand. She could feel him there behind her, not in an unsettling way, but in the way that you feel the presence of someone whose energy is steady and grounded. "Martha makes it weak," he said after a moment. "I'll make it stronger," Lillian said, and she did. When she set the cup in front of him, he picked it up, took a sip, and set it down. He looked up at her with those amber eyes. "That's better," he said. It was a small thing, and she knew it was a small thing, but something about the directness of it, the absence of flattery or performance, made her feel like she had passed a test she had not known she was taking. By the end of the first week, she had settled into the rhythms of the double W as though she had been there for months. She rose before dawn, had the coffee on and breakfast started before Mr. Webb came downstairs, and kept the house in a state of clean, quiet order. She was not a woman who chattered or fussed, and this suited the men of the double W well. The ranch hands were respectful, slightly awkward, the way that men who spend most of their lives outdoors often are around women, and she treated them all with the same steady courtesy she would have given anyone. August was different from the hands. He was rarely in the house except for meals and the occasional evening when Mr. Webb liked to have him in for a game of checkers, but his presence was felt throughout the ranch in the systems he had put in place, the organization of the work schedules, the way the cattle were rotated through the pastures, the discipline and morale of the crew. He was not a man who needed to raise his voice to be heard. Lillian began to notice things about him the way you notice small things when you are paying attention to the world around you without meaning to. The way he always returned tools to exactly where he found them. The way he was patient with the youngest ranch hand, a boy of 17 named Thomas, explaining things twice without irritation when Thomas did not understand the first time. The way he paused sometimes before speaking, as though he took seriously the weight of words. She noticed that he ate what she cooked without comment or complaint, but that after 2 weeks he had made a habit of stopping in the kitchen doorway after supper and saying something brief. Not about the food, never about the food directly, but about things adjacent to it. That she had found the dried chilies in the back of the pantry that Martha had apparently forgotten about. That the biscuits this morning had been good. That there was a patch of wild rosemary on the south hill behind the barn if she wanted it for cooking. "You know your herbs," she said one evening, leaning against the kitchen counter while she dried the last of the supper dishes. "My mother grew them," he said simply, and did not elaborate. She did not push. She had learned that August Whitaker said what he meant and no more, and that the space around his words was not emptiness but intention. She went out to find the wild rosemary the next afternoon on her half-day off, following the slope behind the barn up to where the scrubby cedar gave way to open limestone outcrops. And there it was, a sprawling, fragrant clump of it growing in a crack in the rock, as though it had decided the rock would simply have to accommodate it. She was crouching down to gather some when she heard a footstep behind her, and turned to find August standing a few yards away, looking out at the landscape spread below them. "I should have told you to watch for rattlesnakes up here," he said, as though he had only followed to deliver this information. "Thank you for the warning," she said, "now that I'm already here." He actually smiled then, fully and briefly, and it changed his face entirely, softened something in it, and she felt a sudden, unexpected warmth in her chest that she did not immediately know what to do with. He did not leave. He stood near the outcrop while she gathered the rosemary, not talking, not hovering, just present in the easy way of someone who was comfortable in silence and in open space. Below them, the ranch spread out in the afternoon light, the cattle moving like slow clouds across the far pasture, the windmill spinning, the smoke from the kitchen chimney rising straight up in the still air. "You like it out here?" she asked. "The land, I mean. Did you choose it or simply end up here?" He was quiet for a moment. "Both, I suppose," he said. "I drifted south from Kansas after the war. I was 18 when I enlisted and 20 when it was over, and when it was done I didn't know what to do with myself except keep moving. I worked cattle drives up the Kisham Trail for a few years, ended up here. Mr. Webb offered me the Foreman job and I took it. That was 7 years ago." "And it became home," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it did." She straightened up, the rosemary bundled in her hand, fragrant and spiky. "I've never had one of those," she said matter-of-factly. "Not really. My father was not the kind of man who made places feel like home." She did not say it with self-pity, only with the plain honesty of someone who had long since accepted a fact without ceasing to feel it. August looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read. "I hope you find one," he said. And then, before she could respond, he turned and walked back down the hill, and she stood there with her rosemary and her strange, complicated chest, watching him go. The weeks passed. May came in warm and dry, and the hills turned gold at their edges as the grasses began to cure in the sun. The ranch was busy with the spring work, branding and doctoring and moving cattle, and August was in the saddle from before sunup to after sundown most days. Lillian fed 12 men 3 times a day, kept the house running, helped Mr. Webb with his correspondence when his hands were too stiff to write properly, planted more herbs in the kitchen garden, and in the evenings, when the work was done and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, she sometimes sat on the front porch with a book borrowed from Mr. Webb's small shelf. It was on one of those evenings, a still Thursday in late May with the first fireflies of the season beginning to show in the cedar grove, that August came up to the porch, and instead of going inside or going to the bunkhouse, he sat down in the second rocking chair. He had a cup of coffee in his hand, poured from the evening pot she always left on the back of the stove. "What are you reading?" he asked. She held up the spine. It was a volume of poetry, Whitman's Leaves of Grass, the same edition that had sat on Mr. Webb's shelf for years with the spine uncracked. "Is it good?" he asked. "It's extraordinary," she said. "Do you read much?" "When I can, winters mostly." He drank his coffee. "I had a teacher in Kansas who believed very strongly in books, beat it into us almost literally. Did it take? More than I let on, probably." She smiled at that and went back to her page, and he sat quietly in his chair, and they remained like that for a while in a comfortable silence that was becoming, she realized, a habit. A habit she looked forward to more than she thought was entirely wise. On the first Saturday of June, Dusthaven held its annual spring social in the open lot beside the church, which the townsfolk cleared of its usual clutter and strung with paper lanterns for the occasion. There was fiddle music and tables of food, and because it was 1874 and the cattle money had been good, a remarkable quantity of lemonade. Almost everyone within 20 miles came, and the Double W crew was no exception. Mr. Webb went because he always went. The ranch hands went because there were girls in Dusthaven. August went because Mr. Webb went, and August had never been able to entirely shake the habit of keeping an eye on the old man in crowds. Lillian wore her best dress, which was a deep blue cotton with white trim at the collar, and she put her hair up carefully and wore the small pearl earrings that had been her mother's. She was aware that she looked well, not because she was vain, but because she had put in the effort and knew when effort had been repaid. August saw her when she came across the lot, and he stopped mid-conversation with the sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Cole Ferris. The stopping was brief and entirely involuntary, and Lillian did not see it because she was looking at the lemonade table. But Cole Ferris saw it. And because Cole Ferris was the kind of man who noticed things and found human nature endlessly entertaining, he smiled into his own cup. Lillian was introduced to the townsfolk she had not yet met, which was most of them since she had rarely left the ranch in 6 weeks. She met the preacher and his wife, the woman who ran the millinery shop, the doctor who had a gentlemanly manner and kind eyes, several ranching families from the surrounding area. She was pleasant and composed and made a good impression because she was genuinely interested in people, and it showed. August found her by the refreshment table an hour into the evening. He had, without entirely meaning to, kept track of where she was in the lot all evening, which was something he had no particular explanation for. "Are you enjoying yourself?" he asked. "I am, surprisingly," she said. "I was worried I would feel out of place. I've been out at the ranch long enough that the idea of a crowd felt foreign." She looked around at the lanterns and the couples beginning to form for the dancing. "But it's nice. There's a warmth to it. It's a good town," he said. "Better than some I've been in." The fiddle player struck up a reel. Several couples took to the cleared space in the middle of the lot. Mr. Webb, who was 71 and arthritic and utterly undeterred by either of these facts, immediately led the minister's wife out to dance. "Do you dance?" Lillian asked. "No," August said, and then a moment later, "Not well." "Those are 2 different answers," she pointed out. He looked at her with that quiet steadiness, and then, with the air of someone doing something they have not given themselves sufficient time to talk themselves out of, he held out his hand. She took it. He was not a natural dancer. He was honest about that, and he did not pretend otherwise. He was stiff at first, careful and deliberate, and she could feel him counting in his head, which made her smile in spite of herself. But he was tall, and he held her securely, and he did not step on her feet. And after a few measures, something relaxed in him and he moved better, and she matched him, and it became something that worked. Something more than worked. Being that close to him, her hand in his hand at her waist, she was aware of him in a way that was difficult to catalog. The warmth of him, the steadiness of his hold, the way he looked at her face when he thought she wasn't looking and then looked away when she was. When the song ended, they stood still for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before separating. His hand left her waist. Hers left his shoulder, and they both looked at something other than each other. "You dance better than you gave yourself credit for," she said. "You're a generous partner," he replied. But he was almost smiling again, and she felt that same warmth in her chest that she felt on the limestone hill with the rosemary, and she thought, for the first time with real clarity, that she was in some amount of trouble. June deepened, and July came in like an open furnace. The heat of a Texas summer was something Lillian had not been prepared for by anything in her Missouri experience. The air itself seemed to weigh more, and the light was so intense at midday that colors went pale, and everything cast a shadow that looked carved. She learned to work in the mornings and evenings, and to rest during the worst of the afternoon heat, which Mr. Webb encouraged because he was a sensible man. During those afternoon rest hours, she sometimes sat with Mr. Webb on the shaded back porch, and he talked and she listened. He had lived a full and varied life, had come to Texas as a young man from Georgia, had built the Double W from nothing over 40 years. He had married once, briefly and happily, and his wife had died young, and he had never remarried. He spoke of her still, sometimes in the middle of other sentences, as though she were simply still present in some form. "You're good for this place," he told Lillian one afternoon, fanning himself with his hat. "It's had too little of your kind of quiet." "My kind?" she asked. "The kind that's actually listening," he said. She appreciated that. She appreciated Mr. Webb generally, his directness, his lack of sentiment about himself paired with genuine feeling for others, his stubborn cheerfulness in the face of his aging body. She could see why August had stayed for 7 years. The old man was worth staying for. August himself remained a daily presence in her life and a growing one in her thoughts, which she found both pleasant and inconvenient. She was employed here. She needed this position. Complicating it with feeling was a luxury she was not sure she could afford. And yet, he began to find small reasons to be near the house at odd hours. She noticed it without remarking on it. A hinge on the back gate that needed fixing. A section of the porch railing he decided needed resealing. One afternoon he spent 2 hours chopping extra firewood when there was already plenty stacked, and she watched him from the kitchen window with something she would not yet name. One Tuesday evening in mid-July, a summer storm rolled in from the west with very little warning, the way Texas storms do, the sky going from hazy to purple-green in the space of 20 minutes. Lillian was in the yard taking sheets down from the line when the wind picked up and the first fat drops began to fall. August appeared from around the barn corner at a near jog. Without a word, he began pulling sheets from the line on the opposite end, working quickly, bundling them in his arms. She did the same on her end, and they met in the middle, each with an armful of not quite dry linen, as the rain came in earnest. They ran for the back porch, laughing, she first and then he a half-second behind her, and they tumbled under the overhang just as the rain became a curtain and the yard disappeared behind it. They stood there both slightly breathless, holding their armfuls of sheets, with the rain hammering the roof overhead and lightning flickering on the far hills. "Thank you," she said, catching her breath. "Shame to let them get soaked," he said. They looked at each other, both still slightly out of breath, and she realized they were standing quite close, the way you end up when you arrive somewhere together in a hurry. The rain was loud and warm, and the smell of it on the dry earth was almost overwhelming, that particular smell of a Texas summer storm, green and electric and alive. "August," she said, and her own voice surprised her, softer than she intended. "Lillian," he said, and he said her name as though he had been holding it in his mouth for a while and was careful with it. And then Mr. Webb opened the back door and peered out at the rain with great satisfaction. "There it is," he announced. "We needed that. Miss Sawyer, are those the good sheets? Bring them inside before they mildew." The moment broke. Lillian looked down at her armful of linen and stepped past August and through the door, and August followed, and the rain poured on and nothing was said. But something had been heard anyway. August had been carrying something for years that he had never spoken about to anyone on the Double W, not to Mr. Webb, not to the hands, and not to himself in any very direct way. He had come out of the war and the cattle drives with a settled sort of loneliness that he had convinced himself was simply how he was, a man better suited to land than to people, more comfortable with horses and open sky than with the particular risks of closeness. He had told himself this so many times that it had started to sound like truth. Lillian Sawyer was making it very difficult to go on believing it. It was not only that she was beautiful, though she was. It was not only her competence or her steadiness, though he respected both. It was something more precise and harder to articulate. It was the way she said exactly what she meant without performing it, the way she paid attention, the way she moved through the house and the day with a quiet purposefulness that was not rigid but had a kind of grace in it, the way she laughed, not often, but when she did it was real and warm, and it changed the whole room. He spent a Sunday afternoon in late July trying to explain some of this to himself while he was alone mending tack in the barn, and concluded that he was making a fool of himself internally, which was better than doing it externally, but not by much. The complication arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the first week of August, in the form of a man named Gerald Doyle. Doyle was a rancher from the eastern side of the county, 40 years old, broad in the shoulder and broad in his opinions, with a smooth manner that some people found charming and others found oily. He had been widowed 2 years prior and had since been looking, in a systematic and commercial sort of way, for a replacement wife. He had heard about the new housekeeper at the W, and he rode out on a Wednesday afternoon, ostensibly to speak with Mr. Webb about a fence line dispute that had been simmering for months. Lillian answered the door. Doyle took his hat off and smiled his smooth smile and introduced himself, and she showed him in and went to fetch Mr. Webb, and by the time the fence dispute had been resolved to both men's adequate dissatisfaction, Doyle had positioned himself at the kitchen table drinking coffee and asking Lillian a series of questions that were friendly on the surface and pointed underneath. Was she settled here? Did she find the work agreeable? Did she find Dusthaven a pleasant town? Had she found the social life to her liking? Lillian answered everything calmly and politely and gave away nothing. When August came in from the south pasture at the end of the afternoon and found Gerald Doyle sitting at his kitchen table, smiling at Lillian Sawyer while she made coffee she had not offered, something in him went very quiet and very still in a way that was not, he recognized privately, entirely rational. He was courteous to Doyle. He was always courteous, but he was brief, and when Doyle finally mounted his horse and rode out, August stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the dust settle. "He comes around sometimes," August said, without looking at Lillian. "I gathered," she said, "he's been looking for a wife since his first one died." "I gathered that, too." August turned from the doorway and looked at her. She was at the stove, back to him, her posture perfectly composed. "Lillian," he said. She turned then. She looked at him steadily, and he had the impression, not for the first time, that she could see more than he was saying. "He seems like the sort of man who mistakes persistence for persuasion," she said. "I'm not likely to be persuaded." The relief that moved through August was disproportionate, he knew it, but it moved through him anyway. "Good," he said. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough. He turned and left the kitchen, and went back out to the work, and spent the ride back to the south pasture telling himself he was going to have to find more words than that very soon or spend the rest of his time at the W in a state of productive misery. The opportunity, when it came, arrived less dramatically than he had imagined. It was a Saturday morning in late August, early, barely light, and Lillian was in the kitchen garden cutting the last of the summer herbs before the heat got too sharp, and August came around the corner of the house on his way to the barn and stopped when he saw her. She looked up. She had a small basket over one arm and her hair was down because she had not yet pinned it up for the day, and it fell over her shoulder and the early light was doing something very particular with it, and he stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, completely without a plan. "Good morning," she said, as though nothing in the world was unusual. "Good morning," he said. He stood there. She waited, not impatiently, just openly, with that quality she had of giving space to things. "I've been trying to find the right time to say something." he said finally, and his voice came out quieter and more direct than he expected. She straightened up slowly and looked at him. "I don't have a practiced speech," he said. "I'm not good at those, but I think you deserve more than watching me try to be useful near the house and then walk away without explaining myself." Something moved in her face, a softness carefully managed. "I notice you," he said. "I've noticed you since the day I drove you out from town. I notice the way you work and the way you think and the way you're honest about things that other people would wrap up in pleasantries. I notice that you make the house feel like something different than it was before. And I notice that I'd like to have more than coffee and porches and herb gardens, though I'd take those too." He paused. "I'm saying this badly." "You're saying it well," she said very quietly. "I'm not offering you anything easy," he continued, because he had decided to be thorough or not bother. "I'm a ranch foreman in a small Texas town. I have a good wage and a decent reputation and not much else to speak of materially. I don't know what your plans were beyond this position, or whether those plans included anyone else, and I don't want to presume, but I'd like permission to call on you properly if you're willing." Lillian set her basket down on the garden wall. She looked at him for a long moment with those green eyes that had seen more than she talked about, and then she said, "I came to Texas with a satchel and a hope for something steadier than what I'd had before. I didn't expect to find it so quickly or in such a specific form." She paused. "Yes, you have my permission." He exhaled, and it sounded like something he had been holding in for some time. "Good," he said, for the second time in their acquaintance on this particular subject, and she smiled at that fully, and it was the best thing he had seen in years. The courtship of Lillian Sawyer and August Whitaker was conducted with the decorum appropriate to the time and place, which meant that it was formally proper and genuinely alive underneath that propriety. He called on her on Sunday afternoons, sitting on the front porch with Mr. Webb conveniently nearby, and slightly deaf enough to afford them privacy without anyone losing their respectability. They talked mostly. Long and rambling conversations that covered vast territory, their childhoods, and what those years had cost them, the nature of the land and what drew different people to different parts of it, books they had read, things they believed and some things they had stopped believing. He told her about Kansas and the war, and what it had felt like to be 18 years old and suddenly faced with the particular violence of that world. She told him about her father and what those years had been, not with bitterness, but with a kind of clear-eyed accounting that he found both heartbreaking and admirable. He brought her things, not extravagantly, because extravagance was not in his nature and she would not have wanted it, but thoughtfully. A good ribbon in green that matched her eyes, bought from the millinery on one of his supply runs into town. A small book of poetry he had found at the general store, slightly battered, that he thought she would like. A bunch of wildflowers pulled from the east meadow, presented without ceremony, which she put in a glass of water on the kitchen windowsill where they lasted 3 days. She cooked for him in ways that were slightly different from what she cooked for the rest of the household, which she did not announce, and which he noticed, and which neither of them spoke about directly. The coffee was always exactly as he liked it. The biscuits appeared on mornings after he had worked particularly hard the day before. Small, domestic, secret acts of care. Mr. Webb, who was neither deaf nor unobservant in any real way, watched all of this with transparent satisfaction. He said nothing to either of them directly, which was a mark of his wisdom, because he knew that August Whitaker was the kind of man who would do better with room to move than with commentary. In September, August borrowed a second horse from the livery stable on a Sunday morning and asked Lillian if she would like to ride out with him to see the canyon on the north boundary of the Double W's land. She had never seen it. He had described it once briefly as worth seeing. She was a competent rider, not exceptional but capable and confident, and they rode north together through the cedar and live oak country in the golden light of a September morning, not hurrying, talking sometimes and sometimes not, and after about an hour the land broke open. The canyon was not enormous, as canyons go, but it was beautiful in the particular way of Texas limestone country, the walls orange and cream and rose, the bottom green with cottonwoods along the thin thread of a creek, the whole thing suddenly appearing in the earth as though the land had opened to show something it had been keeping private. They dismounted and stood at the rim and looked down into it. "Oh," Lillian said softly. He stood beside her and watched her face. She was not looking at him, and so he could look at her without self-consciousness, and what he saw was a woman who was genuinely moved, her eyes tracking the colors of the walls and the small silver glint of the creek below, her whole face open in a way it was not always, the habitual composure temporarily dissolved by beauty. "It's been here forever," he said, "and it still does that to me. Every time." She turned and looked at him, and they were standing very close, and for a moment neither of them moved. He kissed her then, carefully, briefly, with the particular care of a man who is aware of what something means. She kissed him back, and it was the kind of first kiss that has the weight of everything that came before it, every porch evening and herb garden and early morning and dance and long conversation. It was all of that compressed into one moment at the edge of a limestone canyon in the Texas hill country. When they separated, she looked at him, and there was something in her face that was not quite like anything he had seen there before. A softness unguarded. "August," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think I have been in love with you for some time, without knowing what to do about it." The bluntness of it, so perfectly her, made him smile fully, and she saw it and smiled back, and the canyon below them and the blue September sky above them and the warm hand he brought to her face were all part of the same moment, which was one of the best moments of either of their lives. Gerald Doyle came back in October, and this time he came with more intention and less pretense. He arrived on a Tuesday, when August was on the far northern pastures with 3 of the hands dealing with a fence line that had come down in the last rain. He sat in Mr. Webb's parlor and told Mr. Webb that he had come to speak about Miss Sawyer, that his intentions were honorable, that he believed she would find his offer of marriage to be in her material interest, and that he was prepared to be generous. Mr. Webb listened to all of this with his head slightly tilted, the way he did when he was being politely patient. "Have you spoken to Miss Sawyer about this?" Mr. Webb asked. "I thought I'd speak to you first, as she's in your employ." "She is employed by me," Mr. Webb said carefully. "She is not owned by me. I think you had better speak to Miss Sawyer." Lillian received Gerald Doyle in the parlor with perfect calm. He sat across from her and made his case, which was organized and practical. His ranch was larger than the Double W, his income reliable, his household in need of a capable woman, and she was clearly capable. He was aware that she might have certain reservations, but he believed those could be overcome with time and familiarity. Lillian listened to all of it with the composure she had spent years developing. "Mr. Doyle," she said when he had finished, "I appreciate that you have thought this through carefully, and I respect that you've been direct. I'll be direct in return. I am not available. My affections are engaged elsewhere and have been for some time." Doyle's smooth expression shifted slightly. "Whitaker," he said, not as a question. "That is a private matter," she said. "He's a ranch foreman," Doyle said, and the way he said it was not flattering. "He is a good man," Lillian said with quiet finality, "and that is worth considerably more to me than the size of a man's cattle operation." Doyle stood. He was not entirely gracious about it, but he went, and Lillian stood at the parlor window and watched him ride out, and she felt nothing for him except a mild, slightly irritated relief. When August came in from the northern pastures that evening and she told him what had happened, he went very still for a moment, and then he said, "Are you all right?" "Perfectly," she said. He was not unpleasant, simply unwelcome. August looked at her for a moment across the kitchen table. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." He was quiet for a moment, deliberate with it. "I know what I told you in August about not having much. I want you to know I've been thinking about it since. I have 7 years of savings that I've done nothing with because I didn't have anything to do with them. Mr. Webb has offered me a parcel of land on the southeast corner of the W, 40 acres, as payment for some things I've done that he felt deserved compensation beyond wages. I've been holding off on deciding what to do with it." He stopped. "What I mean to say is, I'd like to ask you to marry me. And I want you to know before you answer that I'm not asking because of Doyle or because of any situation or pressure. I'm asking because I've been meaning to ask, and I was taking my time about it because I wanted to be sure of what I could offer you." Lillian looked at him. She looked at him for a long, full moment, at this careful, steady, amber-eyed man who chopped extra firewood and brought her green ribbons and stood at canyon rims in the September light. "Yes," she said simply. He stood up and came around the table, and she rose to meet him. And when he kissed her this time, it was different from the canyon, warmer and longer and full of something that had been building since a bruised spring morning when he had taken her satchel without making a fuss about it. "Yes," she said again, against his shoulder because it bore repeating. They were married in December, in Dusthaven's small church with the crooked steeple, on a cold and brilliant day when the sky was a deep winter blue and the air smelled of cedar and frost. Mr. Webb walked Lillian down the short aisle because she had no family to do it, and he was the closest thing. And he did it with such visible emotion that several people in the congregation had to look away. August stood at the front of the church in his best shirt and his cleanest hat, and he watched her come toward him with an expression that the minister later described to his wife as the look of a man who finally understands something very important. Lillian wore her blue dress, which she had let out slightly at the waist and added new white trim to the collar and cuffs, and her mother's pearl earrings, and she carried a small bunch of rosemary tied with the green ribbon August had given her, which she thought was both practical and appropriate. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, but they said them with full weight, looking at each other the way people do when they mean every syllable. When it was over and they walked out into the cold December air to the sound of the small congregation clapping and Mr. Webb loudly blowing his nose, August took her hand and held it, and she looked up at him. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, and they both smiled, and the winter sunlight was clear and hard and beautiful over the hill country hills. They moved into the small limestone house August had begun building on the southeast 40 acres 6 months prior, anticipating optimistically a 2-room structure with a good fireplace and a kitchen garden plot and south-facing windows that let in the winter sun. It was not large, but it was solid, and it was theirs, and Lillian moved through it with a quiet joy that she did not try to diminish or contain. She kept her position at the W's main house through the spring because Mr. Webb genuinely needed someone, and she genuinely liked the work and the old man, and August continued as foreman, and they rode together to and from the main house each day, which was its own pleasure, those morning and evening rides through the cedar hills with the light changing and the season turning. Mr. Webb began to slow down that winter, which was expected, and which he discussed frankly with both of them. His joints were worse in the cold, and he was having some trouble with his heart, nothing acute, but a tiredness that he could no longer entirely ignore. He had no children, no immediate family. The W was his life's work, and he had been thinking, he said, about what should become of it. He put it to them one January evening over supper, with the directness of a man who has decided not to waste time. "I'd like to leave the W to you both," he said. "Not all of it, not yet, but I've had my lawyer draw up papers that would transfer ownership on my death, or earlier if I decide I want to see it happen while I'm still here to enjoy the site." He looked at August. "You've run this place for 7 years, and you know it better than anyone. And you," he looked at Lillian, "have made it feel like something again." He cleared his throat. "I don't want it broken up and sold off to some land company from the East. I want it to stay what it is." August and Lillian looked at each other across the table. "Mr. Webb," August said, with a steadiness that covered a great deal of feeling, "that is an extraordinarily generous thing." "It's practical," Mr. Webb said firmly, and I won't argue about it. Now, is there more of that apple cake, or did young Thomas get to it again? The spring of 1875 came in gently, warm and wet, with the grasses going deep green and the wildflowers running riot along every fence line and hillside. It was a beautiful year for the land. The cattle were healthy, the prices were good, and the Double W was running well. Lillian discovered in March that she was expecting a child. She told August on a Tuesday morning when he was getting ready to go out for the day's work, already at the door with his hat on. She said it simply, the way she said most things, and he turned around and looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something so purely unguarded that she felt her throat tighten. He crossed the room and took both her hands in his and held them. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm very well," she said. "Good," he said, and then quietly, "Good." He was late to work that morning, which was unprecedented, because he sat down at the kitchen table and they talked for an hour about all of it, what they hoped and what they wanted for this child, what kind of people they wanted to be as parents, what the little limestone house would need. The conversation was practical in parts and tender in others, and at the end of it he kissed her forehead and went out to work with an expression that the ranch hands noticed immediately, and that Thomas, being 17 and observant, correctly identified as happiness. Mr. Webb, when told, was so visibly delighted that he had to be talked out of immediately building an addition to the main house that no one had asked for. "There will be a child on this land," he said, with an air of deep satisfaction, "and that is exactly right." Lillian continued to work through the spring, because she was well and she liked to work, and she was not a woman who treated her own health as either more or less fragile than it was. But she slowed somewhat as summer came, and by August she had stepped back from the heavier work at the main house and spent more time in the small limestone house and the garden, which had grown considerably by then. August hovered, which she found both touching and occasionally excessive. She told him this directly, which made him laugh, which was becoming more common now, that real and warm laugh that she thought was one of the best things about him. Thomas, who had become devoted to Lillian over the past year in the way of a younger brother, appointed himself an unofficial helper and showed up at the little house on his days off to do whatever needed doing, whether that was carrying water or repairing the garden gate or simply sitting on the porch and keeping her company while August was out working. The baby came in November, on a cold and still night with stars thick over the hill country hills, a boy, strong and loud and real, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into the same amber as his father's. They named him Clarence James Whitaker, the first name for Mr. Webb and the second for August's father, a quiet man from Kansas who had taught August that work and silence were both forms of love. Mr. Webb, upon being told his name had been given to the baby, went out to the porch of the main house and stood there in the cold for several minutes, by himself, and when he came back inside his eyes were red at the edges, and he said nothing about it, and neither did anyone else. The winter of 1875 into 1876 was the fullest and most settled season of Lillian's life. The little limestone house was warm with firelight and the smell of cooking and the particular alive noise of a healthy infant, and August came home each evening to find her there, and she looked at him when he came through the door in a way that made the days cold and difficulty fall off him like something shed. He had not known before this what it meant to have a home in the full sense of the word. He had known land which he loved and work which he valued and the company of people which he tolerated and sometimes enjoyed. But this, a woman who knew him and had chosen him, a son asleep in the next room, the smell of coffee and the sound of the wind against a house that was his, this was something different. This was the thing he had been moving toward since Kansas, through all those years of trails and open country, without ever having a name for it. He told her this one evening in February when the fire was low and the baby was asleep and the world outside was a cold, still, deep winter Texas night. He told her plainly, without decoration, the way he told her everything. She listened with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on his face. "I know," she said when he had finished. "I can see it. Can you? Every evening when you come through that door," she said. "Yes." He reached across and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside, the cold pressed against the limestone walls and the fire settled, and the baby breathed in the next room, and neither of them needed to say anything further. The following spring, Mr. Webb made good on his intention. He sat down with August and Lillian and his lawyer from Dusthaven, a meticulous man named Mr. Aldrich, and transferred the deed of the W to August and Lillian Whitaker jointly, retaining for himself the right to live in the main house for the remainder of his life, which everyone intended to be long. He signed the papers with his arthritic hand and looked at the two of them with an expression of such complete satisfaction that it was impossible not to be moved. "I built this place from nothing," he said, "and I have left it to good hands. I can't think of anything better than that." Running the W as owners rather than employees was a shift in scale and responsibility, but August had been managing the place for 8 years by then and knew every inch of it, and Lillian knew the household and the accounts, which she had been helping with since Mr. Webb's hands made writing difficult. They stepped into it together with the same complementary competence they had been showing all along. The Whitaker Ranch, as people began calling the W, became known in the county for its well-kept land and fair dealing. August had a reputation for honesty that was so thoroughgoing that a handshake from him was considered as reliable as a written contract. Lillian had a reputation for good sense and generosity, and the small limestone house, and then, as they built the larger one over the following year, the main house, was a place where people who needed a meal or a night's rest found both without being made to feel the weight of charity. Thomas grew into a capable young man and stayed on as one of their best hands, loyal and hardworking, and still inclined to show up at the kitchen for coffee at moments of uncertainty. August had mentored him quietly and thoroughly for 3 years by then, and the results were visible. The issues of that time were not invisible to them. The land disputes between ranchers and the small farming families who were arriving with increasing frequency were a constant tension in the county. August had strong feelings about fairness in these disputes, having come from nothing himself, and knowing the difference between a man who wanted to work land and a man who wanted to own it without tending it. He made it known, as clearly as a quiet man makes things known, that no Whitaker land would be used against a neighbor's fair claim. There were also the ongoing and deeply unjust realities of Reconstruction-era Texas, the freedmen who had been promised much and delivered little, the Apache and Comanche peoples whose land this had been, and who were being systematically removed from it, the poverty and violence that ran beneath the surface of the frontier's expansive mythology. August had seen enough of human cruelty in the war to have no illusions about it, and Lillian had grown up with enough experience of powerlessness to have great feeling for those who had less than she did. These things did not go unremarked between them. When a freedman named Benjamin Cross came to the W looking for work in the summer of 1876, August hired him without the hesitation that some other ranchers in the county would have shown, and paid him the same wage as the other hands, which was not universal practice, and which caused some comment in Dusthaven that August received with the brief, final manner of a man who has decided the matter, and is not continuing the conversation. Benjamin Cross turned out to be one of the finest horsemen August had ever seen, which he had suspected from the way the man walked up to a nervous horse and spoke to it before he touched it. He became an invaluable part of the W, and over several years a genuine friend to both August and Lillian. In the late summer of 1877, Lillian told August she was expecting again. Clarence was 2 years old by then, into everything, with his father's steady disposition and his mother's curiosity, and the small world of the growing Whitaker Ranch was full of his noise. August received the news with the same undisguised feeling he had shown the first time, and they sat at the kitchen table in the evening light, and Clarence sat on August's lap gnawing on a piece of bread, and the evening outside was soft and purple, and the stars were beginning to appear. "What do you hope for?" she asked. "That it goes well," he said immediately. After that, he looked at her over Clarence's head. "A girl, maybe," he said, "to keep you company." "Clarence keeps me excellent company," she said. "I've noticed," she smiled. "A girl would be nice, though," she admitted. The second baby was a boy, born in February of 1878, healthy and golden-haired, where Clarence was dark, loud, and cheerful from the first moment, so unlike his brother's gravity that Lillian laughed when she saw him. They named him Henry Thomas Whitaker, the second name for Thomas, which pleased Thomas so thoroughly that he was unable to speak about it coherently for several days. Mr. Webb, who was 76 by then and considerably slower but still sharp-minded and present, held baby Henry with the careful hands of a man who knows he is holding something irreplaceable, and looked at August with eyes that said a great deal without requiring words. He died in the spring of 1879, peacefully, in his sleep, in the main house that had been his life's work. August found him in the morning, and the grief that moved through the Whitaker household that day was real and deep, the grief of losing someone who had been genuinely important. Lillian and August sat together that evening after the boys were asleep and did not try to fill the space of it with words, because some losses deserve their full silence. They buried him in the small cemetery on the hill behind the church in Dusthaven, and August carved the headstone himself, which took him 3 weeks and was one of the most precise and careful pieces of work he had ever done. It read simply, "Clarence Webb. He built well." The double W continued to grow under the Whitaker stewardship through the late 1870s and into the 1880s. August made shrewd decisions about which cattle lines to develop and which pastures to rest, and Lillian managed the household accounts with such competence that they were able to expand carefully, and without the debt that crippled many ranches of the era. They were not wealthy by the standards of the large Texas ranching empires, but they were solidly comfortable, and more importantly, the work was theirs and the land was theirs, and the life they had built on it was entirely and specifically their own. Their household grew as well. In 1880, a girl arrived at last, born in October when the persimmons were ripe and the hills had gone gold and amber. She had Lillian's green eyes and August's dark hair, and an expression from the first days of her life that suggested she was taking notes. They named her Clara Rose Whitaker, and she was, from her first year, very clearly going to be a force. Clarence at 5 was solemn and helpful, and already following his father around with the focused attention of someone who intends to learn everything. Henry at 2 was joyful and reckless in ways that required constant supervision and made everyone in the household laugh. Clara from the beginning was alert and demanding and intensely interested in everything, which Lillian found both familiar and satisfying. August was a father who was present in all the practical ways and also in the less practical ones, the bedtime stories, the patient explaining of how things worked, the slow rides on the easiest horse when the children were old enough, the games on the porch in the evenings. He was not a demonstrative man by nature, but with his children something opened in him that was very natural and very whole, and Lillian watched it with a fullness of feeling she could not have adequately described. She remained herself throughout all of it. She was not a woman who had dissolved into her marriage or her motherhood, but one who brought herself fully into both, with her opinions and her humor and her clear-eyed honesty intact. August would not have wanted it any other way. He had loved her for exactly what she was, and the years had only made that more specific and more true. They still sat on the porch in the evenings when the work was done. They still talked, long and wide-ranging, about everything and nothing. They still disagreed sometimes, with the directness of two people who respected each other too much to pretend, and found their way back to agreement or to a satisfying clarity about where they differed. They still laughed, often now, more often than either of them had laughed in the long years before the other. In 1882, Thomas married a young woman named Alice from a farming family on the east side of the county, a quiet and steady woman who Lillian immediately liked, and August gave him the 8 acres on the east boundary of the Double W as a wedding gift with a directness that made Thomas go red in the face and find something urgent to look at on the ground. Benjamin Cross had, by that same year, become one of the most respected horsemen in the county, training horses for several ranches and building a small business and a reputation that was hard-won and entirely deserved in a world that made such things significantly harder for a man of his background. He had purchased a small plot of land of his own with wages saved over years, and the Whitakers had helped where they could without making a production of it, because that was how they preferred to do things. The family had established itself not just on the land but in the fabric of Dusthaven, which had grown in those years from a scattering of sun-bleached buildings to something with genuine community in it. More families, more businesses. The addition of a proper school in 1879, where Lillian's children would all eventually learn. A second church. The expansion of the general store. The frontier was still wild enough, the work was still hard, the distances were still enormous, and the land still demanded everything from the people who tried to tend it. But there was also now a solidness to it, a sense of accumulation, of something being built that would last. On a May evening in 1883, Lillian sat on the new porch of the main house, which they had expanded 2 years prior when they had decided to move from the little limestone house, now occupied by one of the newer hands and his young wife. The evening was warm and the air smelled of cedar and the wild plum that was blooming along the creek bed, and the fireflies were doing their earliest and most tentative appearances in the blue dusk. Clarence was 8, reading a book on the steps with the focused intensity he brought to everything. Henry was 5, running in the yard with the uninhibited energy of someone who had not yet discovered reasons to slow down. Clara, almost 3, was asleep inside in the early evening the way small children are, completely and profoundly. August sat in the chair beside Lillian, coffee in hand, watching Henry run in diminishing circles as the dusk deepened. "Do you remember," Lillian said, "what you said to me that morning in the garden, when you asked permission to call on me?" He looked at her. The evening light was doing what it always did with her face, finding the warmth in it, the green in her eyes. "I said I wasn't offering anything easy," he said. "You did. Was it?" She considered this honestly, the way she considered everything. "Parts of it were very hard," she said. Starting over in a new place, worrying through pregnancies, losing Mr. Webb, the years when the rain didn't come enough and the work was brutal and exhausting. She paused. "But no," she said. "It was not the kind of hard I had before. It was the kind of hard that has something to show for it." He reached over and covered her hand with his, the same gesture from that February evening years ago in the little limestone house. She turned her hand over and held his. Below them in the yard, Henry had stopped running and was now lying on his back in the grass looking up at the first stars, arms and legs spread like a small starfish. Clarence looked up from his book, looked at his brother, and then went back to reading with an expression that was so exactly like his father that Lillian had to look away or she would laugh. "August," she said, "yes, I love this life." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the darkening hills, the windmill silhouetted against the last of the sky, the shape of the land he knew better than anything. "So do I," he said, "more than I knew how to before you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did not often do in the open where the hands could see. But the evening was quiet, and the hands were in the bunkhouse, and the children were her children, and she had decided not to waste the moment. He let his cheek rest briefly against her hair. Below them, Henry sat up and announced to the darkening yard that he had found the brightest star. Clarence, without looking up from his book, told him that was not actually a star but Venus, which was a planet. Henry disputed this. The argument began at the volume appropriate to a 5-year-old who knows he is right and an 8-year-old who actually is right. And inside the house, Clara woke up and added her own voice to the general noise. And August straightened up, and Lillian lifted her head, and they looked at each other across the small, necessary chaos of their family with the full and unambiguous warmth of two people who had found, against considerable odds and after considerable searching, exactly where they were supposed to be. They sat there a little longer in the last of the May evening, the limestone hills going dark around them and the stars coming clear above, before August stood and held out his hand to help her up, and she took it, and they went inside together to their children and their life and the warm, lit rooms of the home they had built. In the years that followed, the Double W grew into its best version of itself. The herd expanded carefully. The land was treated with the respect of people who intended to hand it down, and the Whitaker name became synonymous in the county with the kind of integrity that cannot be manufactured or purchased, but only demonstrated consistently over years. Clarence, who had inherited his father's seriousness and his mother's precision, showed from his early teens an aptitude for the land and the cattle business that made August think, privately and with great satisfaction, that the Double W would be in good hands after him. Henry, golden-haired and sociable, turned out to have a gift for horses that matched and in some ways surpassed even Benjamin Cross's considerable skill, and spent his adolescence learning everything he could, an apprenticeship that Benjamin oversaw with the pride of a man who has something genuine to teach. Clara, those green eyes always calculating, bright and opinionated and thoroughly herself, made clear by the time she was 10 that she intended to know everything about the ranch accounts, and that no one should try to redirect her toward embroidery. Lillian watched all three of them with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had not been certain, in the years before Texas, what her life was building toward, and had discovered that it was building toward this. She and August aged together with the same honest directness they had brought to everything else. There were lines now at the corners of his amber eyes, more gray at his temples. She had gray of her own coming in at her hairline, which she wore without apology. He still brought her things, less often now because 30 years of marriage had earned them the right to simply live instead of courting, but sometimes, unexpectedly, a bunch of wildflowers from the East Meadow or a book he had found at the new lending library that had opened in Dusthaven. She still made the coffee exactly right. Some habits were not habits but simply love made habitual. On a September afternoon in 1894, 20 years after she had stepped down from a stagecoach in Dusthaven, Texas, with a worn leather satchel and a bruised sky overhead, Lillian Whitaker stood at the rim of the limestone canyon on the north boundary of the Double W with her husband beside her. They had ridden out alone because Clara was old enough to manage the house for an afternoon, and the boys were in the north pasture, and they had both felt, independently and then simultaneously, the need for the canyon. The walls were the same orange and cream and rose. The cottonwoods below were beginning to turn with the first cold green going to gold at their edges. The creek was a thin silver line in the afternoon light. 20 years, she said. 20 years, he agreed. She looked at him, at this man she had chosen and been chosen by, at the silver in his hair and the lines in his face and the amber eyes that were the same as they had ever been, steady and warm and entirely present. Was it what you hoped? She asked, not because she doubted the answer but because she liked the hearing of it. He turned and looked at her for a long moment, the way he had looked at her on the porch of the little limestone house that February evening when she had told him she loved him, as though she were the particular point where everything he understood about the world came into the clearest focus. "It was better," he said. "It was better than I knew how to hope for." She took his hand at the canyon's rim, his familiar, calloused, warm hand, and they stood together in the September light and looked out over the land that was theirs, the canyon below and the hills rolling away in every direction. The life they had built spread across it all like something planted and tended and finally, fully bloomed. And the hawk that had circled on the morning she arrived in this country, or perhaps its descendants, was circling still, high and patient above the limestone hills, and the land stretched on in every direction, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and they stood in it together, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.